Hey everyone, and welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Please find us on all your favorite podcast platforms and find us at our YouTube channel. Leave your comments in the sections below, and we will get to them in some upcoming episodes. So today I'm joined by Lakshay and Shashi. So how's everybody doing? Guys, where's this podcast find you? Shashi, where you at?
I'm in lovely Houston, Texas, where we can't decide whether we want cold weather or hot weather.
Yeah, I'm in Durham and just kind of on the East Coast. We're kind of missing all the storms right now. So we've got massive, snow all across the Northeast and that kind of thing, but missing that. Lakshay, I'm guessing you're in Portland. Everything okay out there?
Yeah, still Portland. Last time we did a location check-in, things were much more grave. But things have since returned to normalcy, just good old 40, 50 degree weather, nice and cloudy, you know how it is.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, it is Super Bowl week, and since as of recording, the Super Bowl happened 2 days ago. So, Shashi, did you watch any takeaways, either football or otherwise, from kind of the biggest spectacle in the U.S.?
I watched. I was cheering for Christian McCaffrey. I grew up in the Carolinas, so had the unfortunate loyalty, fading loyalty to a Carolina Panthers team that hasn't been good for many years now. But McCaffrey got traded to the 49ers, and so continued to kind of cheer for him. He had a good game, fun trick play there. But Pat Mahomes is incredible. He's the standard bearer for this age, and great win for them. Just want to kind of highlight the halftime show and the experience of the halftime show with my kids, which is really fun because they had no idea who any of the performers were. So it was great. And my wife and her friends were wagering on whether Usher would take off his shirt. My wife bet that he would, and he did.
He did indeed. That's funny. Yeah, I saw a meme circulate on X or some otherwise. It was like, if your back doesn't hurt, you don't get to comment on the Super Bowl performance because you wouldn't know who the people were. So that was funny. Lakshay, anything to add? I know you're not much of you don't follow football.
No, I'm just like surprised that Usher was the halftime show. It's just like on the comment of like relevance, not to say he's like irrelevant, but it's just like funny that like given like the modernity of audiences, it just feels like he's a little bit dated, I guess. Like Beyonce, like whatever, like a couple of years like there, so like they still make albums or whatever. But I feel like I haven't heard of Usher doing anything that had a lot of prominence to it in like the last couple of years. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. He also brought out Alicia Keys, Lil Jon, Ludacris. So it was definitely kind of a little older school.
Do you know the origin of the halftime show?
I don't know the year, but I do know the sequence of events that happens. Basically, whoever was, broadcasting the Super Bowl the year this happened, CBS or otherwise, essentially they swapped. They didn't have any entertainment section for the halftime of the Super Bowl. So in that, they essentially had all viewers in one place. There was a commercial that was done during halftime of the Super Bowl that attracted a large number of those viewers off of the CBS platform to a competing, service provider or a network company. And so the very next year they hired Michael Jackson to retain those viewers, basically. So there was just a massive amount of viewer drift that was happening, and so they decided to invest millions of dollars into a halftime performance to keep those eyeballs on the ads that they could serve.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember this. In 1992, In Living Color had a half-hour halftime show that they advertised heavily. Audiences migrated from kind of the channel where the Super Bowl was being played over to the channel where In Living Color was doing their half-hour show, and then come back, which means the Super Bowl ads all plummeted in terms of viewership. Lots of angry advertisers. The next day, they signed up Michael Jackson to do the 1993 Super Bowl halftime show, and that was the very first one. And just one last thought on Super Bowl overtime. Great game, really exciting Super Bowl. Considering most Super Bowls, most championship games, including the recent Michigan championship game, it ended up as blowouts. So it's nice to see kind of a competitive game all the way through the end, and that certainly paid off.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. A little bit boring, especially in the first quarter and scoreless, and then it kind of did peak at the end, which is great. I'm also just I would be remiss if I didn't mention it with Kansas City's run that they're on right here. I have some family in that area, so my sister and brother-in-law are there, and then my brother's also in the KC area, so living a little bit vicariously through them, who are obviously enjoying the run. So my brother was at the parade last year. I'm sure he'll be at the parade tomorrow. So I think they're enjoying it. So I don't really have much of a rooting interest. Most of the time, my rooting interest in sports are entertainment. So as long as it's entertaining, then I like it. But similar to you, Shashi, just kind of marveling at the resume that Patrick Mahomes is building is noteworthy, and I really enjoy watching really talented people do really great work. So I think anytime I can see things like that, it'll be interesting to reflect. Having lived through it, I think it's interesting. So yeah, I'll have to say, pretty interesting. None of the commercials to me really stuck out. So I don't know that. Again, if you have a favorite commercial, feel free to share. But for me, they were a little bit flat.
The Duolingo owl she's like very, very prominent Forbes 30 under 30 person. She's from my high school. She's 1 year older than me. And just like had a very, very prominent effect on just like Duolingo's brand and social media presence of this like kind of unhinged behavior. And it was pretty cool. I don't know if this has been like done a lot before, but at least like beyond that like 5 second thing itself of just like Duolingo's like butt growing out and just like telling you to do your Duolingo. It was kind of cool to see that was like synced across the country of like everyone was getting a notification at the same time, like no buts, do your lesson now. Like I thought that was just like a cool little gimmick. A little bit more than just like watch an ad, assume the users do something later on. It's cool.
Yeah. It's an interesting thread that you open up there because I do think that traditional advertising loses out to online media advertising, especially, Google or Meta or otherwise, just because there's that immediate click through action and you can kind of prompt your users to do things because they're already on the screen. But if you have a TV, you can't do that. So we've seen other people do like, scan the QR code and that kind of thing. And I don't really know to what degree of success that's worked, but I'm not a Duolingo user, and I don't really know anyone that is. So I was actually unaware that there was a synchronized notification that got sent out. And but I really do like that idea where it's kind of this, almost immediate feedback of, call to action versus just the simple, like, here's, our latest ad. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the last time I've seen like this sort of like direct, like the purpose of this ad is to get you to engage with something that's not the TV. I think I'm forgetting which like crypto company it was last year. They did that like that just bouncing QR code, no explanation. Obviously, people were just like, "What the hell is this?" And they scanned. But I think like even just like obviously Duolingo just like has such a like a large brand presence and just like a very, very recognizable identity that they can afford to just take a 5 second commercial rather than some 30-second thing explaining a bunch, and just like create this one unifying sound effect that all of a sudden people know is like, oh, it's time to do my lesson, which is kind of cool. Because it's just like a effort, I guess.
Yeah. I think it was Coinbase last year for what it's worth. I think it was Coinbase that had the commercial you're referencing, but yeah. So also kind of summarizing and ending the conversation on the Super Bowl and then kind of launching into another topic. It was also the most watched Super Bowl of all time. I think there's, some interesting perspective there that a lot of that comes from the attention that Taylor Swift has brought to the NFL this year and kind of the increased demographic that wouldn't otherwise be kind of tuning in to the Super Bowl, but did so because of her relationship to the Chiefs tight end Travis Kelce and, whether she was going to make an appearance on the camera, which she did a few times, which is, in my opinion is nothing but great, but I don't really want to belabor that here. But speaking about large numbers and completely shifting gears, there was also news over the last week or so of Sam Altman's new ambitions to maybe build out the chip company that we've referenced a couple times on this platform. But this is the first time, at least that I'm aware, that we're seeing a potential number to how much money he's looking to raise. And there are reports for a raise up to $7 trillion. So I guess the immediate question is, if that number is real, why 7 trillion? What do you think 7 trillion get you? Is there space to compete with NVIDIA, who as of yesterday, I think became the fourth most valuable company in the world? So I don't know, Shashi or Lakshay, anyone want to start with their thoughts on Sam Altman's newest, projected fundraise, if nothing else?
Yeah, from what I've seen, like it seems that like what he wants to engage with is like it's not just the chip manufacturing, like he wants to do the entire supply chain. Like it seems that the intensity of the efforts like supposed to be like end to end ownership of a new supply chain, a new manufacturer, a new distribution network for GPUs, or rather like generalizing to AI chips. Um and I think like we've kind of tossed around this idea before about what that looks like. I've seen just like Twitter commentary that's like he wants to provide funding to like, for example, like give funding to TSMC to like make factories in like different locations, whatever. So I don't think it's exactly material what he's trying to engage with. Like, does this mean like starting a whole new factory of its own, or is he just trying to like funnel money into different companies that already exist? Um, but it's interesting nonetheless. Like, that's a very very big quantity of money, obviously. But when you think about just like what does, if we were to start this from scratch, like it becomes a little bit more reasonable as to what it means tangibly. Hard to say.
Clearly the intention here is to address directly the AI chip shortage and overall general kind of semiconductor chip shortage for all advanced devices. We've been talking about that in this pod for weeks now, that the biggest bottleneck is the hardware. And this is clearly, again, signaling that Sam's very open expression of where he sees the bottleneck in the overall technical process is the hardware. And so um, it's confirmation evidence for what we've been thinking and what we're seeing in the market, that there's simply not enough hardware for everyone to build the kind of application they want to build. And so that's the bottleneck step. He's trying to address it directly. Apparently, in conversations with some countries in the Middle East and others, it's almost an absurd number. But in a way, by saying a number like that, what you're doing is shifting the Overton window to a higher number, so that if you settle for only a $2 trillion fundraise, well, that's way, way more money than you would have gotten if you started with, I need to raise 500 billion, and then you settle for a 150 billion fundraise. So I think, in a way, having that big, scary, crazy number makes it easier for him to raise a substantial number. Even if he does raise this money, it's going to take many years for chips to be produced from a new fab. It's just very hard to imagine anything within 5 years of a fundraise, given kind of the size of project it would be. At least that's my impression.
Yep, just like a classic anchoring effect. It is interesting take. I think just adding to that slightly with less specificity to the actual Sam Altman of it all, but just speaking on kind of global semiconductor manufacturing, right? There's a large concentration of global supply that comes directly out of TSMC in Taiwan, and there's some obvious choke points with that, as we all experienced in COVID, right? We saw everything from car prices to smartphone prices increasing just because of a global supply chain kind of shortage there. And so I do think it probably is net that there would at least be duplicate, foundries in different places where semiconductors could be made. I think my curiosity always just stems back to like, is it such thing that NVIDIA is on track here to kind of have a winner takes all market dynamic in the AI chip world? It feels to me like it probably is going to materialize more like the smartphone market, in which one or two, maybe three dominant players kind of share almost in equal parts the global, market of kind of chips in general, GPUs specifically, but maybe even CPUs and beyond. So yeah, I don't know. I guess we're very early on. We'll see how that plays out. I agree with you that spinning up that new company is a multi-year timeline at best, maybe even a decade timeline, assuming potential challenges. But it's interesting, I think, nevertheless, and definitely ambitious, which I applaud. So,
do you think this supports the NVIDIA stock? The bullishness of NVIDIA stock over the next 3 to 5 years, given the amount of money it would take to build a competitor, potential leader, and kind of their market dominance today.
Yeah, I think if I was going to make the bull or the bearish case rather against NVIDIA, it would go something like they will remain the industry leader in GPUs. However, models will become more efficient such that they can run to the same capacity they're currently running and be good enough running on, you know, inferior hardware, such that the market demand for the highest level of GPU decreases. I think that's probably the only realistic bearish argument I can make on NVIDIA for the kind of foreseeable future. How that actually plays out in market dynamics, I think, is a little bit of a can of worms. I don't pretend to be a business fundamentalist when it comes to kind of trying to evaluate market share. I don't know what the PE of NVIDIA is, for example, or anything like this. But I think if I'm going to forecast and try to make a prediction on, what are some things that can move against NVIDIA when it does seem like they're kind of on this rocket ship, it's just simply by slowing demand because the software kind of outpaces the need for these most advanced systems for the majority of use cases. I think you'll always need the highest performing GPU for select use cases, but the more niche that becomes, like if you no longer need the highest performing GPUs to train the next foundational model, for example, for whatever reason, I could see that being the case for the bear side of NVIDIA, if you will. All that said, if I'm having to bet on one or the other, I think I would bet bull on NVIDIA, just given everything I'm seeing right now.
The NVIDIA forward earnings PE ratio is about 36 times. 36 times their next year's earnings expectation. As a point of comparison, Tesla has been beaten up pretty significantly over the last couple of weeks for a variety of reasons. And yet, even after that, their forward PE, the Tesla's forward PE is north of 57 times, which either suggests that Tesla has a long way to go down or that NVIDIA potentially has a long way to go up.
I think if there were someone to actually thinking back to let's say when CPUs were the name of the game, a bunch of companies entered that space. Intel, AMD were kind of the two main players and everyone else was specialized. I can see that world emerging. It just feels that to me, it feels like this space for GPUs, someone, if there is going to be a competitor, they need to show up much sooner rather than later. And I think the thing that to me is the most bullish argument is the fact that the people who want to use these GPU driven systems are building in university settings, they're building in academic settings. The people who are driving decisions about what hardware is driving what systems are being made, they're coming from backgrounds where NVIDIA SMI is the default piece of OS that you interact with to do your model running, whatever, right? And I think especially just in industry, there's just this especially when you go up in academic caliber of a person, there's just so much of a preference for just operate things the way academics already operate. So it feels like there has to be a very massive step change for someone to say oh, you're used to using NVIDIA SMI. We're this new company. We're going to be developing this new tool. Please relearn how to build all your models on this new thing. It just doesn't seem very likely to me. And so I feel if there is going to be a proper competitor, they have to get pretty embedded into just the academic space in general, since that's where models are being made. That's where big hardware is being called on first, and then kind of evolve from there. I think one case I do see is that if a Google or an Amazon of the world, someone with a very significant compute cluster were to say, hey, we're going to make our own thing, and that just kind of culturally spreads out from a big tech company and just kind of emerges okay, we're no longer using NVIDIA SMI, we're using our own custom chip. Apple does this, for example. That's how they kind of hurt Intel by a significant margin. They made their own compute, became the standard in their own hardware, and whether that will bleed out or whether it stays in their infrastructure, who knows? But they managed to make a significant dent in what was Intel's business because of that. And so I think if that were to happen, I could see it. It's just I don't know how you effectively change patterns of ML practice outside of just getting the academic setting to find a reason to convert over. And it doesn't seem very likely that a startup's going to be able to do that in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, let's just kind of turn the focus internally there and think about it. What would it take, do you think, for you to make the decision to run things that you have traditionally run on, an NVIDIA GPU, such as some of the things we've done for, semantic search, let's say, or something else, to a new GPU, right? What would, I guess, some of the factors be that would help influence you in that direction, even if you ultimately think you may never get there, which I think is a perfectly valid, opinion.
if the AGI LLM ran on something that was not compatible with NVIDIA, I'd instantly switch. Right? Like it has to be like, I have to have a really, really strong reason to justify creating possible tech debt and investing in something that like is not compatible with anything that's existed historically, and go ahead and say like, okay, this thing is like a major, major feature addition. No one else in the world can do it. Only works on this one thing. I'll make the investment to cut over and experiment with it. To me, like it has to be like the feature that I'm getting out of this thing that's not NVIDIA, and like having to figure out, okay, like how does it cooperate with all my other services? How does it operate with like AWS, all that sort of stuff? That's a big tech investment and a big like debt investment that has to like reasonably pay off. And I think like AGILM, of course, is hyperbole, but it has to be like pretty significant caliber wise. Point that being the point, to say, I'm going to drop NVIDIA. I'm going to drop all of this like community support, all this tooling people have already made, whatever. I don't have to think about this stuff. I just install and I run. Versus, okay, this thing's entirely new. I have to sit down and figure this out for like a month on end to finally get this working the way I wanted to. That's the sort of thing that would get me to move off of an NVIDIA if it's so significant that I'd be willing to spend a month trying to figure out how to get it running.
Just responding to that directly, it does weave an argument there that if OpenAI did want to invest in their own kind of chip or hardware infrastructure that did enable their, LLM, and that's the world's best LLM. Right now, it's assumed that once the chip is ready for, consumer use, that's still the case. There might be enough of a compelling argument there to say, if you want to run the best large language model in the world, you also have to do it on this specialized GPU, specialized in whatever way, I'm not sure yet, but your kind of, your outline of that at least made me believe that there could be an inherent advantage of tying those two things together if we're headed for a world in which there is a significantly differentiated or more powerful LLM, which, maybe we believe is probably not the case, but, maybe it feels like a non-zero probability in any event.
To just touch on the AGI aspect of what we just discussed, Sam Altman's been the biggest proponent and conversation starter about AGI coming soon. And with this kind of proposal for 5 to 7 trillion of chip investment, I wonder if at some level those are tied in his mind, that 5 to 7 trillion of new hardware would be required in order to fully realize the potential of AGI. What do you think?
I think based on listening to Sam speak over the last 18 to 24 months, I think that he believes, and again, I'm misinterpreting his, outline here, but my understanding of the things that I've heard is basically he feels there are two levers to pull with specific regards to training foundational models. They are data and compute. And if he really believes that kind of we're exhausting data because we've kind of crawled the entire internet, and, at least at scale, there's not really any more material data to add in there, at least not that public companies would have access to, right? You can make the argument that Reddit is sitting on a data source and maybe they can protect, or Google via YouTube or something else. But point being is, if we're reaching the ceiling of how much data can be pumped into those two into foundational models, then the other lever left to pull is compute. So the argument tracks. Whether or not it's real or not, I guess, is to be seen. But
yeah, I feel like especially like within the last like 2 or 3 months, I feel like I've seen more content from Sam Altman specifically, just kind of like undermining the idea of AGI, and just like him kind of like labeling it as like, oh, it's like not what people are imagining it to be, or just going to be like the way AGI is actually going to be used is not going to be like super exciting. It just feels like I've seen a lot of clips of that sort of nature. But I think like there are interesting moves that are happening about whatever AGI means, like that being very subjective to different people. Like one thing that's at least interesting to me is that like there seems to be this idea that they're pursuing, like this is just again like another random article of the idea of like letting a model like visually see what someone's doing and copying it. So for example, if you were to go to Airbnb, there's a set of behavior you do to get a booking, right? And there's like apparently like this thing that they're working on that allows like a model to do exactly that. So it just like watches a couple people like try to do something for one time, understands the objective, and you can turn a prompt into effectively like operationalizing an agent over a random website, right? And that to me, like that's a big step forward insofar as like okay, now all of a sudden, like these models, which are just like regurgitating information, now they're able to like take a very broad set of actions and have agency over them. But obviously, like the compute there is much more intense because all of a sudden now you have to worry about like video and you have to worry about like monitoring like behavior over like some level of real time. Um, so I think like the data problem beyond enterprise use cases feels like its importance is just going down a little bit. And it feels like the next thing to do in the motion towards AGI is agency, like allowing a general intelligence to actually act on what it knows. And that way, like the compute continues to be the primary bottleneck, data we can get whenever we want, assuming people are trusting of what they're doing with the model.
It kind of feels to me, let's say like we're in almost a 3-step sequence here with regards to AGI and kind of whatever that means. Right now, the insights are kind of very limited. They're basically just information search and synthesis, right? It's like go out and find this thing, kind of tell me information, and then it's up to me to do whatever I need to do with that information. It does to me feel like the next step is exactly what you've described, where the AI not only can return information, but can go out and actually perform actions that are based on the computer, right? So booking travel would be a very easy example, right? Or managing finances or something like that, where you're just kind of, all of that can be controlled electronically. The final stage in which I really think where AGI has its kind of ultimate impact is in integrations with humans beyond the keyboard or even advanced robotics beyond the keyboard, right? You can see, it'll probably be one then the other. It'll probably be humans and then eventually robotics. And so maybe it's more of a 4-step plan and kind of the way that I've laid it out. But in any event, it does feel to me like right now we are beginning to make way into stage 2, and in each sequential phase, whether it's 3 or 4, it feels to me like the value of AI, regardless of whether it's true AGI or not, goes up exponentially. And so I'm just really excited kind of both for what we're doing at ScholarAI and then kind of just broadly as to what happens as we can move into those things. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna say on the yeah, sorry, on the like idea of like these kind of like levels, I guess, to whatever AGI means. I think we've seen so this idea of like letting a model like act on the internet, submit forms, whatever. The first like big company that at least like was heavily marketed of having this feature was that Rabbit, that little like orange piece of hardware. And that's precisely what they do. And it seems like that makes like a lot of sense where it's just like you're taking web scraping to the next level and just like making it something that like a robot can do. I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens with robotics in that regard, because there's a lot of research like of that same sort of model where what you're teaching the robot is like what motors it has, like what sensors it has, and like what data is available to it. And we even see like, I think more so these days than ever, a robot learning from like a human operator. So a human operator has like the controls for this robot hand, and that's the training data set for the model to then be able to perform the same behaviors. So it'll just be interesting to see like how that scales, because it kind of seems like in the academic space, it's kind of happening in parallel, which is interesting at least.
Yeah, I think extending that thought slightly, actions as an input for training on these AI models is really interesting to me because it is kind of a perfect mirror of how human beings learn, right? Like we typically do, not only do we read information, but we do watch and learn literally. And so I just think it's fascinating and probably the most logical next progression for AI systems, whether they be screen based or robotics, is simply, I'm going to instruct you how to do this thing by showing you how to do this thing. And then just like enough inputs of that nature, leading to kind of mimicking of those things is again, just a fascinating kind of thought tree. Okay, great. I do want to kind of talk about a little bit about something that I've been reading about before we fully transition into kind of some new and upcoming things we've got at Scholar AI. I'm seeing numerous examples. Most recently, a paper in Nature, specifically, it was Nature Machine Intelligence, I believe. I'll double check that. But the point being, yeah, Nature Machine Intelligence. But the point being is, rather than using the most advanced large language model, so rather than opting for GPT-4 or GPT-4 Turbo, these authors actually use GPT-3, and instead of just kind of setting it out to do tasks they actually fine-tuned it. So they took a lighter weight, easier to kind of retrain model, did fine-tuning there, and actually saw outsized performance and lower cost, faster speeds than if they would have done the same in GPT-4 or otherwise. And so without speaking with the specifics of that paper, it just is a fascinating thought to me to think about. My intuition and belief has kind of always been that fine-tuning the most advanced base model would lead to the best results. But this paper was kind of first evidence that maybe that isn't the case. And we'll see if that trend holds true or not. But Lex, I was going to ask you, I mean, as somebody who has thought a lot about fine tuning, whether it be commercial models or open source models, do you have any, thoughts on pros, cons versus training a fairly lightweight model versus something that is maybe as large as, GPT-4 or something?
Yeah, at least in the seat I'm in, like the way I look at fine tuning is like, for me, when I'm choosing how to like plan around it, for me, it's like cost saving is the most like obvious benefit. It's been like pretty well shown, like again, very anecdotally, like I don't know if I could attach a number to this, but it's been like pretty obvious that like if you want to build like, let's say you have user traction on whatever product or tool you're building, and you have like GPT-4 as like the model you're using because it's easy, it's really fast. It's kind of been like appearing that like the best thing you can do, at least like reducing your burn or like just getting like costs somewhat more reasonable than what OpenAI would charge you, is get a smaller model, fine tune it on the outputs that you had in your previous like whatever implementation, whether that's GPT-4. And that also kind of gives you the space to then like play with other model types, like a mixture of experts or something, rather than just pure GPT. And so I think like I would imagine, again, not having heard of people doing this, that like fine tuning on GPT-4 or whatever the most recent model is probably going to be better than fine tuning on something older. But the reason to consider fine tuning in the first place is either cost savings or you like need like crystal clear like comparisons between your documentation and what's live. I think it's also interesting though. I don't know how companies are approaching this, where especially when it's been like documents in general, like, okay, backing up a step. In general, a lot of these cases for fine tuning have been in as a second choice to RAG. For example, like you have a set of like corporate documents, your enterprise wants to be able to like parse over them. And there's two approaches. One is fine tune your model to have read all those documents and just like kind of trust that with enough fine tuning, it'll do a good job repeating the content of those documents, or do RAG, that like you're using the generic model, you're just feeding it input and telling it to talk about that input. And I think it'll be interesting now that a lot more people are playing with it, like how you kind of dance between the two. Because like it does seem weird to like fine tune your output when your output is RAG driven, if that makes sense. Where like it's very query dependent. It's very like whatever your interjection step is for your source, that also modifies the output. So then what exactly do you fine tune on? Do you just fine tune on like how well did it generate off the RAG piece? Are you fine tuning on just how well the input and the RAG piece map? I think there's a lot more questions there that are still a little bit unanswered, but we'll see.
I was talking to a friend who he's a lawyer, he's a trial lawyer, and in certain kinds of cases, he was talking about the importance of the written brief. And we were talking about that in the context of large language models. And in that specific case, because the writing itself is so important in the style of writing, having consistency there makes a big difference. My advice to him was to consider fine-tuning with briefs that he's written personally and briefs by people he highly respects, and take that as kind of the core material from which he fine tunes. And he wouldn't need to necessarily do that on an expensive model, but he could do that on a less expensive model and really just let it gear toward his style of writing, the way that he makes arguments. That feels like a very achievable outcome, and for writing-based professions, feels like one that could easily be extended, whether that's writing research papers or writing grant applications or writing professionally, writing books or writing journal articles, magazine articles. I could imagine those kinds of writing-based professions really being optimized for and saving people, the best professionals, more time by using fine-tuning on perhaps a lower cost model. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think like I agree. I should have mentioned that the style is the one thing that like RAG can't do, where fine tuning can. Um, I think I don't know, having not been super exposed to like, or rather like not engaging super deeply with the fine tuning stuff. I wonder how much like tooling there is, because a lot of fine tuning is like, hey, like curate my data set for me, like feed it into the model, like run these training batches over it, print it out, and store it somewhere. I wonder for someone who's not like a developer, like how easy that process is in general. OpenAI has stuff for that, but even then, like it feels like it's not super accessible to folks who might want it, especially like when we're talking about something like creative spaces or law, where like style is very, very subjective.
I think there's a lot of money to be made by
Mhm.
someone who makes that process really easy from both a UI and a tech stack kind of implementation for just a non-technical lawyer, writer, author to be able to fine tune on their own personal material and have an output go out in their style, their preferred writing, logical sequence, and so on.
Hmm.
I think I have seen instances where GPT-4, maybe even 3.5, has been able to craft output in the style of somebody whose writing exists a lot in the public domain, right? So again, just trying to further evidence that if you can somehow upload your preferred writing style to these models, they can probably recapitulate it quite well. The interesting thought that leads me down is I think, and I hope, that we're headed towards a reality in which the ideas are the things that become evaluated, where historically the kind of ability to craft the ideas has almost been over indexed on, in my opinion, right? So, like, basically, there's a lot of writing that has previously been weeded out because it hasn't been written to the narrative tone or to the kind of ears of the intended reader. And so the ideas contained within that writing just simply aren't heard as well as maybe comparatively worse idea, but is written in a more standard packaging because it is better to or easier to digest. And I do just wonder if one of the skills that we're kind of almost filtering for in a future in which writing, or at least the kind of standards of writing, become very standard, is the ideas itself, which in theory seems like a better reality to me. And where ideas are judged more on their merit than on their packaging. But I don't know, just an interesting thought I had as you all were kind of speaking about that.
Yeah, there's an interesting like problem. How much of a problem it is again subjective, but there's a like discussion, I guess, ongoing about like we're increasingly relying on like AI generated text, and that's what we're consuming, right? And increasingly so, not like all over like every single field, but in general, like more and more people are writing, or rather like copying the content out of AI and putting it into whatever they're doing. So for especially with like code, right? You get this sort of like weird reinforcement of like the code standard that is being established is one that AI generation just happens to be reinforcing, right? And if that's going wrong, like let's say like it's not up to a certain quality standard, there might not be enough data to shift that away because the amount of people copying and like publishing content that's AI driven is going to weigh more volume wise than the content that's corrective. Um, and so, like, as to how that gets solved, hard to say. But it's interesting nonetheless. I mean, it happens all the time. Like, you see people with like GitHub Copilot where like there's a common problem that's been known to be solved a better way, but people ask it to generate the solution. It generates the solution like the old way, even though that's less correct than was the new way that's not published to a significant extent.
It's another interesting idea, and we'll kind of finish with this. But it is the case that in a world in which a lot of information comes from AI models, there will be almost by definition an inherent bias to the most widespread opinion or the most widespread information, right? The information that is the most abundant will be the ones that are most easily accessed. by AIs. And so I do think there will have to be, again, guardrails put in place such that abundance or volume is not the metric, not the primary metric for what the AI is generating, right? The AI will need to be able to distinguish between the thing that's talked about the most and the thing that is the most helpful for a given query. That's, again, where things like, the proper rank sorting and these kind of, advanced RAG systems are probably going to come into play, but we'll kind of see how that materializes. So with that, we'll wrap for today. We're kind of at time. So thank you all again for joining us on the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Get this podcast in all of your typical podcast locations and find us on YouTube at the ScholarAI YouTube channel. Leave your comments in the section below and we'll be sure to get to them in an upcoming podcast. Thank you all for joining. See you next time.